Hey guys, tonight we're not just digging into history. We're drifting back thousands of years to a land of golden sands, towering pyramids, and a river that breathed life into a desert. We're heading to ancient Egypt, a civilization renowned for its pharaohs, its gods, and its monumental achievements. But we're not here to decode hieroglyphs or explore a pharaoh's tomb in the usual sense. Instead, we're on a much cooler quest, a search for the unlikely, almost mythical origins of something we all adore: ice cream. Or at least its most ancient, sun-drenched ancestor? Imagine yourself there, the Egyptian sun, a relentless, fiery orb in an endless blue sky, beating down on the shimmering desert. The air is dry. The heat radiates from the very stones beneath your feet, and every sliver of shade is a precious, sought-after commodity. In a land defined by such intense heat, the very idea of something frozen, something to cool the parched throat and weary spirit, would have been the ultimate luxury, a dream whispered on the hot desert wind. You probably wouldn't survive a quest for a genuinely frozen treat here without divine intervention from a particularly cool god, or perhaps a very, very long relay of extremely fast servants heading to some impossibly distant mountain. Just a thought. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're all tuning in from tonight. So drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our global community of sleepy history explorers. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the edge of the vast Sahara, the great sand sea, as it stretches out before you. An ocean of rippling dunes under that immense, unforgiving sky. The heat is a physical presence, a weight on your skin, a shimmering haze distorting the horizon. This is the dominant reality of Egypt, a land sculpted by the sun. Ancient Egypt's climate was predominantly hot and arid, with the Nile River Valley providing the fertile land necessary for civilization, but also experiencing intense heat, especially during the summer months, which could see temperatures soaring well above 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the kind of heat that makes you instinctively seek out the cool, damp interiors of buildings, or the shade of a palm tree, if you're lucky enough to find one. The kind of heat where your own shadow becomes your best friend. You can almost feel the ancient Egyptians doing the same, their daily lives profoundly shaped by this ever-present solar intensity. Of course, there's the Nile, the lifeblood of this ancient land. As you move closer to its banks, the air changes subtly. The stark dryness of the deep desert gives way to a more humid warmth, especially during the inundation season when the river would swell and spread its life-giving waters and fertile silt across the narrow floodplains. This strip of green, the Black Land, or Kemet, as the Egyptians called it, was where civilization flourished. A vibrant ribbon of life hemmed in by the Red Land, or Deshret, the barren desert. But even in this fertile valley, the sun's power was inescapable. The heat would rise from the irrigated fields, from the mud brick walls of the villages, from the bustling marketplaces. Finding relief, finding coolness, was a constant, daily pursuit. Maybe this is why they were so good at building those massive stone temples and tombs. They were probably looking for a place that stayed reliably cool year-round. Forget the afterlife. Akhenaten. I just want a basement that doesn't feel like a furnace. How did the ancient Egyptians cope? Their ingenuity was remarkable. They wore light, loose-fitting clothing, primarily made of linen, a fabric perfectly suited to the hot climate, allowing air to circulate and moisture to evaporate. You see them in tomb paintings and reliefs, clad in simple white kilts or flowing sheaths. Their attire a testament to practical adaptation. They sought shade wherever possible, whether beneath the broad leaves of a sycamore fig tree, under an awning in a busy market, or within the relatively cooler confines of their homes. Some homes, particularly those of the wealthier, might have incorporated architectural features designed to promote ventilation, such as small, high windows to let out hot air, or courtyards that could trap cooler night air. The precise effectiveness and widespread use of architectural features like dedicated wind catchers, known as malkaf in later Arabic Egypt and domestic dwellings across different social strata and historical periods of ancient Egypt, is still a subject of architectural historical investigation. While later periods certainly saw sophisticated examples, the extent of their use in, say, the Old or Middle Kingdoms for common folk is less clear. But the principle of designing for airflow was certainly understood. They knew which way the prevailing north wind blew and tried to catch its cooling breath. The universal human desire for coolness, for something refreshing to counteract the oppressive heat, would have been intensely felt. In a world entirely without artificial refrigeration, without the flick of a switch air conditioning or the convenience of a modern freezer, what did coolness even mean? It wasn't about ice cubes clinking in a glass. It was about achieving a temperature noticeably below the ambient swelter. Perhaps something akin to cellar cool, or water made fresher by the subtle magic of evaporation. Even a slight drop in temperature for a drink or a morsel of food would have been a significant luxury, a delightful sensation. It's this craving, this dream of coolness in a sun-baked land, that forms the very first, very tentative step on our journey towards something that might, just might, be considered a distant ancestor of ice cream. Forget crocodile dung sunscreen for a moment. Yes, that was apparently a thing, though probably not for its SPF rating. The real status symbol might have been owning a pot that genuinely kept your water from tasting like warm soup. A quirky or fringe tidbit from tomb paintings is the frequent depiction of servants vigorously fanning nobles or important officials. These weren't just decorative fans, they were essential tools for creating an artificial breeze, promoting evaporative cooling from the skin, and offering a small measure of personal comfort. Some fans were large, elaborate affairs made of ostrich feathers, wielded by attendants whose sole job was to keep their master or mistress from melting. It's a visual reminder of the constant, labor-intensive battle against the heat. It makes you wonder if there were fan-waving competitions, or if a particularly skilled fan-waver could demand a higher salary. My lord, my wrist is cramping, but your noble brow remains admirably free of perspiration. That'll be an extra 2 deben of silver this week. The psychological impact of coolness, or the lack thereof, cannot be overstated. In such a climate, cool water, a shaded resting place, or a refreshing food item wouldn't just be physically pleasant. They would be symbols of relief, of luxury, of a brief respite from the sun's relentless dominion. For the elite, for pharaohs and high priests and wealthy landowners, the ability to command coolness, to have access to even slightly chilled beverages or foods when others sweltered, would have been a significant marker of status and power. It's this desire, this ability to command resources, that often drives innovation, or at least the elaborate mobilization of labor to achieve what seems impossible. So, as we stand here, feeling the imaginary desert sun on our faces, let's hold on to this central idea in ancient Egypt. Coolness was a precious commodity. The quest for it, however rudimentary by our standards, was a constant. This fundamental human desire, set against the backdrop of a scorching climate, is the fertile ground from which the unlikely origins of our story will begin to sprout. It wasn't a quest for a double-scoop waffle cone with sprinkles. That was millennia away. But for any small, delightful cooling sensation that could offer a moment of bliss in a world of pervasive warmth. The ancient Egyptians were masters of many things. Perhaps, just perhaps, they were also pioneers in the very earliest, most tentative steps towards taming the heat with chilled delights. Having established the almost palpable craving for coolness in the relentless heat of ancient Egypt, let's now glide into the more opulent settings of their society, into the heart of their food culture, particularly as it was experienced by those who could afford a little luxury. Before we can even begin to imagine the ancient Egyptian precursor to ice cream, we need to understand what they were eating in general, and specifically, what constituted their desserts or sweet courses. After all, any chilled delicacy would likely have built upon existing culinary traditions and available ingredients. So, prepare your imaginary palate as we explore the sights, sounds, and flavors of an ancient Egyptian feast, searching for the sweet endings that might have paved the way for a pharaoh's frozen fantasy. Picture yourself as an honored guest at a banquet in the home of a wealthy noble or a high-ranking official, perhaps during the New Kingdom, a period of great prosperity and cultural achievement. Banquets in ancient Egypt. especially among the nobility and royalty, were elaborate affairs featuring a wide variety of foods, music, and entertainment, as vividly depicted in numerous tomb paintings and reliefs. These weren't just quiet family dinners, they were social events, displays of wealth and status, and sometimes religious observances. You'd be seated on a low stool or perhaps a mat, the air filled with the scent of roasting meats, fragrant oils, and blooming lotus flowers used for decoration. Musicians might be playing harps, lutes, and flutes, their melodies weaving through the conversations. Dancers, graceful and athletic, might entertain the guests, their movements telling stories or simply adding to the festive atmosphere. It was a multi-sensory experience designed to delight and impress. The tables, or more accurately, low offering stands and individual small tables, would be laden with an astonishing variety of foods. Bread, in countless shapes and sizes, was the absolute staple of the Egyptian diet, as was beer, a thick, nutritious brew that was consumed by everyone, from the pharaoh down to the humblest laborer. But at a feast like this, you'd see much more. There would be roasted fowl, goose, duck, pigeon, quail, fish from the Nile, perhaps grilled or baked, cuts of beef, mutton, or goat. Though meat was more of a luxury for special occasions or for the wealthy, and an abundance of vegetables, crisp lettuce, pungent onions and garlic beloved by the Egyptians, and famously fed to the pyramid builders for strength, lentils, chickpeas, cucumbers, and melons. Everything would be artfully arranged, a testament to the skill of the household cooks and servants. You probably wouldn't find a menu card with calligraphy, but the sheer visual spread would tell its own story of abundance. One can only imagine the ancient Egyptian equivalent of Yelp reviews for banquet caterers. 5 stars for Nebamun's roasted goose. The accompanying fig relish was divine. The harpist was a bit off-key, though. But what about the sweet course? The ancient Egyptian equivalent of dessert, after the savory dishes were cleared, or perhaps alongside them in a continuous flow of offerings. What would tantalize the palate-refined sugar as we know it was completely unknown in ancient Egypt? Their sweet cravings were satisfied by nature's own bounty. Fruits were paramount. Imagine platters piled high with fresh, succulent dates, a cornerstone of their diet and a source of intense natural sweetness. Figs, both fresh and dried, would be offered, their jammy texture and sugary pulp a delight. Grapes, bursting with juice, would be plentiful in season, as would pomegranates, their jewel-like seeds offering a tart counterpoint to sweeter fruits. Watermelons and other types of melons, cool and refreshing even at ambient temperature, would have been highly prized. These fruits, eaten fresh and unadorned, often constituted the simplest and most common form of dessert. Honey was the undisputed king of sweeteners. Beekeeping was a sophisticated art in ancient Egypt, and honey was a precious, highly valued commodity. It was used not just in food, but also in medicine and religious rituals. So, at a noble's feast, you would certainly encounter dishes sweetened with honey. This could take the form of simple honey cakes, perhaps made with ground grains like emmer wheat or barley, mixed with honey and spices, then baked or fried. Some tomb paintings depict offerings of intricately shaped bread and cakes, and it is likely that many of these, especially those intended for the gods or the deceased elite, were enriched with honey. A quirky or fringe tidbit from analyses of residues in ancient Egyptian pottery suggests the production of various sweet, possibly fermented, fruit or grain-based beverages that might have been served at feasts, perhaps functioning as a kind of liquid dessert or a sweet digestive. Think of a thick, sweet fruit nectar, or a mildly alcoholic beverage made from fermented dates or figs, rich and cloying. There might also have been confections made from fruit pulp, particularly dates and figs, perhaps pounded and mixed with chopped nuts like almonds, if available, or tiger nuts, Cyperus esculentus, a type of sedge with edible tubers and honey, then shaped into balls or cakes. These would be dense, chewy, and intensely sweet, the ancient equivalent of an energy bar, but far more decadent. The Romans, much later, described an Egyptian baked custard-like dish called tyropatina, which involved milk, honey, and eggs, baked until set. While this specific recipe is from a later period influenced by Hellenistic and Roman cuisine, it's plausible that simpler, earlier forms of milk-based puddings or custards, sweetened with honey and perhaps thickened with breadcrumbs or grain flour, could have existed, though they would likely have been served warm or at room temperature. The idea of a chilled dairy dessert was still a significant leap away, for reasons we'll explore. The exact recipes and preparation methods for many ancient Egyptian desserts or sweet-baked goods are often reconstructed from artistic depictions of food offerings in tombs. Lists of provisions for the afterlife, and occasionally, archaeological finds of desiccated food items. Detailed culinary texts or recipe books from ancient Egypt are unfortunately very rare, leaving much to scholarly interpretation and educated guesswork. We see the end product in the paintings, but the precise journey from raw ingredients to finished dish is often a tantalizing mystery. It's like trying to recreate a gourmet meal based solely on a few beautifully filtered Instagram photos, without the ingredient list or instructions. What's clear is that the ancient Egyptians had a definite sweet tooth, or at least a deep appreciation for the natural sweetness provided by their fruits and the precious honey from their bees. Their desserts were likely robust, relying on the intense flavors of dates, figs, and honey, rather than the more subtle or refined sweetness profiles we might be used to today. And presentation mattered. Just as the savory courses were artfully arranged, so too would the sweet offerings be presented in an appealing manner, perhaps on fine pottery dishes or in woven baskets, adorned with flowers or fresh leaves. So, as the imaginary feast draws to a close, and the sweet taste of dates and honey lingers on your palate, the crucial question begins to form: if these were the sweet delicacies they enjoyed, how might they have taken the next, almost unimaginable step of trying to make them cold? Not just cool, but truly refreshingly chilled, a counterpoint to the ever-present warmth of their world. That's the thread we'll begin to unravel as we delve deeper into the specific ingredients and the ingenious, if limited, cooling technologies available to them. For now, just savor the thought of those ancient sweet endings, a testament to nature's bounty on the fertile banks of the Nile. We've had a taste of the lavish banquets of ancient Egypt and seen that their sweet courses relied heavily on the natural bounty of the land, particularly fruits and honey, given the complete absence of refined cane sugar. To truly understand the foundation upon which any chilled dessert, a proto-ice cream, if you will, might have been built, we need to delve deeper into these natural sweeteners. These weren't just incidental ingredients. They were cornerstones of the Egyptian diet and culture, imbued with flavor, energy, and even symbolic meaning. So, let's wander through the imaginary date groves and inspect the ancient beehives to appreciate the nature's candy that flavored their sweetest dreams. First and foremost, we must pay homage to the date palm Phoenix dactylifera. This majestic tree was, and still is, a symbol of life and fertility in arid lands. And in Egypt, it was a true gift of the Nile. Date palms thrived in the Egyptian climate, lining the riverbanks and oases, their feathery fronds offering welcome shade, their trunks providing useful timber, and their fruit providing an incredibly versatile and concentrated source of sweetness and nutrition. Honey was the most important sweetener in ancient Egypt and was highly valued, used in food, medicine, and religious rituals, with evidence of sophisticated beekeeping practices. However, dates provided a more readily available and abundant source of sweetness for the general populace and for bulk use. While honey was a concentrated luxury, dates were a democratic delight, accessible to many. Imagine the sight of a mature date palm laden with clusters of ripe fruit, ranging in color from golden yellow to rich reddish brown, depending on the variety. The Egyptians cultivated numerous varieties of dates, each with its own unique characteristics of sweetness, texture, and flavor. Some were best eaten fresh, their flesh soft and meltingly sweet. Others, with a lower moisture content, were perfect for drying, a process that concentrated their sugars further and made them an excellent, long-lasting food source, perfect for storing through the hotter months or for taking on journeys. These dried dates, pressed into cakes or simply stored whole, would have been a staple energy food, their natural sugars providing a quick boost. You can almost picture a weary laborer by the Nile, or a traveler crossing a stretch of desert, pausing to chew on a few sweet, sustaining dates. It was nature's original power bar. In the context of desserts or sweet treats, dates were incredibly versatile. They could be eaten as is, a simple and satisfying end to a meal. They could be pitted and stuffed, perhaps with chopped nuts like almonds if available and affordable or the more common. Crunchy tiger nut tubers. They could be pounded into a thick, rich paste, which could then be used as a filling for breads and cakes, or simply eaten with a spoon or fingers. This date paste, essentially date honey or dibs, could also be thinned with a little water to create a sweet syrup, perfect for drizzling over other foods or for sweetening beverages. The sheer intensity of flavor and sweetness from sun-ripened Egyptian dates would have been a dominant note in many of their confections. Tomb paintings frequently depict offerings of dates, underscoring their importance not just in daily life but also in the provisions for the afterlife. Clearly, the Egyptians wanted to ensure they had a good supply of nature's candy on the other side. Can't face eternity without my daily date fix. A mummy might have thought, if mummies had such coherent culinary anxieties. Now, let's turn to honey, the liquid gold of the ancient world. While dates were abundant, bee honey was a more concentrated, refined, and therefore often more prized sweetener. The ancient Egyptians were accomplished beekeepers. Archaeological evidence and detailed scenes in tomb paintings, particularly from the Old Kingdom onwards, show us their apicultural practices. They typically used horizontal clay pipe hives, often stacked in rows. Smoke would be used to pacify the bees during honey extraction, a technique still employed today. The honeycombs would be removed, and the honey pressed or drained out. It would likely have been a raw, unfiltered honey, probably containing bits of beeswax, pollen, and propolis, all of which would have added to its complex flavor and, unbeknownst to them, its potential health benefits. The quality and flavor of this ancient Egyptian honey would have depended on the local flora from which the bees gathered nectar. Along the Nile, this could include a variety of flowering plants, acacia trees, clover, lotus blossoms, and various desert blooms. This would result in a polyfloral honey with a unique regional character. Honey wasn't just a foodstuff, it was a luxury item, used by the wealthier echelons of society to sweeten their dishes, their wine, and their lives. It was also a key ingredient in medicine, valued for its soothing properties and its ability to act as a preservative. And, as mentioned, it was a common and important offering to the gods in temple rituals. A jar of good honey was a worthy gift for a pharaoh, a god, or a particularly esteemed dinner guest. One can only imagine the buzz around the royal apiaries. The pharaoh demands only the finest lotus blossom honey for his morning toast. Ensure the bees are appropriately inspired. Beyond dates and honey, other fruits contributed to the sweet landscape of ancient Egypt. Figs. Both sycamore figs native to Egypt and common figs introduced later were widely cultivated and consumed. Like dates, they could be eaten fresh, soft, sweet, and filled with tiny crunchy seeds or dried, which concentrated their sugars into a chewy, intensely sweet treat. Fig paste, similar to date paste, could also be made and used in various confections. Fig trees were often planted in gardens and were associated with Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, and motherhood. Grapes were another important fruit, primarily cultivated for winemaking, but also eaten fresh as a sweet and juicy treat, or dried into raisins. While most Egyptian wine was likely dry, some sweeter wines or grape juice concentrates might have been produced and used as sweeteners or flavorful additions to dishes. Pomegranates, with their vibrant red color and sweet tart arils, provided both flavor and visual appeal. Their juice could be used in beverages or sauces. Carob pods, though perhaps less glamorous, contained a naturally sweet, chocolate-like pulp when dried and ground, and could have been used as a sweetener or flavoring. And smaller, wilder fruits, like the Christ thorn Ziziphus spina Christi, also known as the nabk fruit, which are small, sweet, and somewhat apple-like, would have been gathered in season and enjoyed for their natural sweetness. The extent to which date syrup or other fruit-based concentrates, like grape must sapa or carob molasses, were systematically produced and used as common sweeteners alongside or in place of bee honey across different social classes in ancient Egypt is still being investigated by food historians and archaeologists. While honey was clearly prized, the sheer abundance of dates suggests that date-derived sweeteners would have been more widely accessible for everyday use. It's likely a combination of all these natural resources contributed to the overall sweetness profile of their diet. So, when we start to imagine the very first, most rudimentary attempts at a chilled dessert in ancient Egypt, these are the flavors we must conjure: the deep, caramelly sweetness of dates, the rich, floral notes of wild honey, the jammy intensity of figs, the bright tartness of pomegranates. These were the building blocks. Any ice cream ancestor would not have tasted of vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry in the modern sense. It would have sung with the sun-drenched sweetness of the Nile Valley's own natural candy. The challenge, then, was not in finding sweetness, but in finding a way to marry that sweetness with the elusive, luxurious sensation of cold. We've explored the sun-drenched sweetness of ancient Egyptian fruits and honey, the very essence of their dessert landscape. But if we're to entertain the notion of an ice cream ancestor, even a very distant one, we need to consider another crucial component: dairy. What kind of milk products did the ancient Egyptians have at their disposal? Could they have produced anything akin to the cream in ice cream? And how did they manage dairy in a climate so unforgiving to perishable foods? Let's peer into the somewhat hazy world of ancient Egyptian dairies, a world where milk was a precious symbol of life, but also a daily challenge to preserve and utilize. Milk-producing animals were certainly a familiar sight in the Nile Valley. Cattle were the primary source of milk in ancient Egypt, and they held a significant place in both the economy and religious iconography. Various breeds of cattle are depicted in tomb paintings and reliefs, often with prominent udders, clearly indicating their importance for dairy. Think of Hathor, one of the most beloved and multifaceted goddesses, frequently portrayed as a cow or with bovine ears, a divine mother figure symbolizing nourishment, fertility, and the sky. This strong association underscores the cultural value placed on milk as a life-sustaining fluid. Beyond cattle, goats and sheep were also kept and would have provided milk, albeit perhaps in smaller quantities or with a stronger flavor. These hardier animals were well suited to the fringes of the cultivated land. There are even some intriguing, though less common, depictions of donkeys and captured wild gazelles being milked, suggesting an experimental or opportunistic approach to sourcing this valuable resource. Milking a gazelle sounds like a particularly challenging occupation. You'd need a gentle touch and very fast hands, I imagine. Hold still. Nefertiti the gazelle. The pharaoh fancies a gazelle milk smoothie this morning. The biggest challenge for dairy in ancient Egypt, as in any hot climate before the advent of refrigeration, was rapid spoilage. Fresh milk, rich in sugars and proteins, is a perfect breeding ground for bacteria, and in the Egyptian heat, it would sour and curdle incredibly quickly, within hours if not minutes if left unattended. This meant that fresh, unadulterated liquid milk was likely a luxury, consumed quickly after milking, perhaps primarily by the very young, the sick, or the very wealthy who could command immediate processing, or the very limited cooling methods we'll discuss soon. It wasn't something you could store in a jug for a few days. Given this, it's no surprise that the Egyptians, like many ancient cultures, developed methods to transform fresh milk into more stable, longer-lasting products through fermentation and processing. Fermented milk products, similar to modern yogurt, kefir, or soured milk, would have been a common way to preserve milk's nutritional value. Natural fermentation, aided by airborne yeasts and bacteria, would occur spontaneously. These products would have a tangy, acidic taste and a thicker consistency. Think of the traditional Middle Eastern dairy drinks like Laban Raib or Laban. Their ancient precursors were likely staples in the Egyptian diet. They were refreshing, digestible, and much less prone to immediate spoilage than fresh milk. Butter was another important dairy product. Tomb paintings depict scenes of butter making, often showing people churning milk in skin bags slung between poles and rocked back and forth, or in tall pottery jars using a plunger-like dasher. The resulting butter, however, would also have a limited shelf life in the heat unless it was further processed into clarified butter ghee, or samna as it's known in modern Egypt, by melting the butter and removing the milk solids in water. The pure butterfat that remains is much more stable and can be stored for extended periods without refrigeration, even in a warm climate. This clarified butter would have been a valuable cooking fat and a concentrated source of calories. What about cheese? The evidence suggests that ancient Egyptians certainly made cheese, though it was likely of a simple, fresh variety rather than the aged, hard cheeses we might be familiar with. Think of something akin to cottage cheese, quark, or a firm, fresh curd cheese. These would be made by curdling milk, perhaps with plant-based coagulants like fig sap or thistle flowers, or simply by letting it sour naturally, then draining off the whey. These fresh cheeses would still be perishable but would last longer than liquid milk and offered another way to concentrate and preserve milk solids. Archaeological finds from tombs have included what appear to be remnants of cheese, and cheese strainers have also been identified. The milk pail list from the tomb of Hezi-Ra, a high official from the 3rd dynasty around 2650 BCE, is one of the earliest written attestations of a variety of different milks and dairy products, showcasing their recognized importance from very early on in Egyptian history. This list includes terms that have been tentatively translated as different types of milk, cream, and perhaps even specific cheese forms, though precise interpretations are still debated. Now, when we think of modern ice cream, the cream component usually implies a high-fat dairy product. Could the ancient Egyptians have produced something like this? While they wouldn't have had mechanical cream separators, they would have known that when fresh milk is left to stand, a richer, fattier layer, the cream, rises to the top. This could have been skimmed off and used as a special enrichment. A quirky or fringe tidbit sometimes mentioned is the depiction in some Old Kingdom tombs of what appears to be force-feeding of cattle, possibly to increase their milk yield, or perhaps even the fat content of their milk. While the primary aim was likely just more milk, a richer milk could have yielded a creamier product. It's also possible they made a form of clotted cream by gently heating milk and allowing the cream to rise and thicken, similar to practices in other parts of the world. This richer component, if available even in small quantities to the elite, could theoretically have been a starting point for a richer chilled dessert. The prevalence of lactose tolerance versus intolerance in the ancient Egyptian population, and how this might have influenced dairy consumption patterns across different age groups and social classes, is an area of ongoing genetic and anthropological research. Like many populations outside of Northern Europe, a significant portion of ancient Egyptians may have been lactose intolerant as adults, meaning they would have had difficulty digesting fresh milk. However, fermented dairy products like yogurt and cheese have much lower lactose levels and are often well tolerated even by those who can't drink fresh milk. This might explain why processed dairy products seem to have been more common than large-scale consumption of liquid milk by adults. It adds another layer of complexity to understanding who was eating what, and how. Perhaps only the royal children got fresh milk, while the adults stuck to the good stuff, the tangy fermented Laban and the salty fresh cheese, which probably went down a treat with a bit of honey and some dates. Another serving of fermented gazelle curd. Anyone it's surprisingly zesty? So, the ancient Egyptians had access to milk, and they were adept at transforming it into various products to overcome the challenges of their climate. They had fresh milk a fleeting luxury, fermented milks more common and stable, butter especially clarified, and simple fresh cheeses. They may even have been able to obtain a richer, cream-like component from their milk. These dairy products, combined with the natural sweeteners we've already discussed, provide another set of potential ingredients for our unlikely proto-ice cream. The question remains, how could they have brought the element of cold to these sweet, sometimes creamy, concoctions? That's where their ingenuity in cooling methods. Our next stop comes into play. We've explored the sweltering heat of ancient Egypt, the sweet delights of their feasts, the natural sugars of dates and honey, and the various forms of dairy they managed to produce in a challenging climate. Now, we arrive at a crucial piece of the puzzle in our quest for the unlikely origins of ice cream. How on earth did they make anything cold? Without electricity, without refrigeration units, without even a basic understanding of thermodynamics as we know it, Achieving any significant degree of coolness for food and drink was a remarkable feat of ingenuity, observation, and often considerable labor. Let's uncover these ancient chilling secrets, the clever methods that allowed Egyptians to coax a refreshing coolness from the very air and earth around them. These techniques are the bedrock upon which any chilled dessert, any proto-ice cream, would have had to be built. The undisputed champion of ancient cooling technology, particularly in hot, dry climates like Egypt's, was evaporative cooling. This is a beautifully simple principle of physics that the Egyptians mastered intuitively. When water evaporates, turns from a liquid into a gas, it absorbs heat from its surroundings, thereby cooling those surroundings. The Egyptians harnessed this by using porous earthenware jars. Ancient Egyptians utilized evaporative cooling by storing water and other liquids in unglazed porous pottery vessels, a practice that effectively reduces the temperature of the contents in hot, dry climates. Imagine a somewhat rough, unglazed clay jar. Water from inside the jar would slowly seep through the tiny pores in the clay to the outer surface. Once on the surface, this thin film of moisture would evaporate into the dry desert air. And in doing so, it would draw heat away from the jar and its contents, making the liquid inside noticeably cooler than the ambient air temperature. The drier and breezier the conditions, the more effective the cooling. It's nature's own air conditioner, albeit a very gentle one. You would see these porous jars everywhere, from humble homes to royal palaces. They'd be used for storing drinking water, keeping it refreshingly cool, or at least less tepid, throughout the scorching day. But the principle could be applied to other liquids too. Wine, beer, or perhaps even fruit juices or sweetened milky concoctions we might imagine as precursors to our chilled desserts. To enhance the effect, these jars would often be placed in a shady spot, perhaps on a windowsill or in a courtyard where a breeze could reach them. Sometimes the outside of the jar might be deliberately wetted or wrapped in damp cloths to increase the surface area for evaporation. A quirky or fringe tidbit from tomb scenes is the depiction of servants vigorously fanning large pottery jars, presumably filled with wine or water for their masters. This wasn't just for show. The increased airflow from the fanning would significantly accelerate the rate of evaporation and thus enhance the cooling effect. It was an active, labor-intensive process to achieve maximum chill. Keep fanning that wine jar. Senefer. The pharaoh desires his grape juice to be merely tepid today, not boiling magma. Another way to harness natural temperature fluctuations was through night air cooling. Desert environments, while incredibly hot during the day, can experience a significant drop in temperature once the sun goes down. The dry air doesn't hold heat well, and the clear skies allow a great deal of terrestrial radiation to escape into the atmosphere. The ancient Egyptians would have been well aware of this. They could leave containers of food or drink out overnight, perhaps in a courtyard or on a flat rooftop, to benefit from this natural cooling. To protect the contents from dew, dust, or curious nocturnal creatures, the containers might be covered with a cloth or a lid, but in a way that still allowed the surrounding cool air to do its work. By morning, the items would be significantly cooler than they would have been if left inside a stuffy room. They could then be brought indoors and perhaps stored in the coolest part of the house to try and preserve that acquired chill for as long as possible. Speaking of the coolest part of the house, cellars and underground storage offered another avenue for achieving and maintaining coolness. Subterranean spaces are naturally insulated from the extreme temperature swings of the surface. The earth itself acts as a massive heat sink, keeping underground areas at a relatively stable, cooler temperature year-round compared to the blazing sun outside. Wealthier Egyptians, and certainly palace complexes and temples, would have had cellars or underground storage chambers. These would primarily be used for storing valuable commodities like wine, olive oil, which was imported, grains, and preserved foods, but any food item or beverage that was intended to be served cool, or whose quality benefited from cooler storage, would find its way into these subterranean retreats. Imagine a royal cellar, dimly lit, the air still and cool, rows of pottery jars containing precious wine slowly maturing. And perhaps, in a special niche, a selection of fruits or sweetened liquids being kept as refreshing as possible for the pharaoh's table. Make sure that fig nectar for the queen is stored in the deepest part of the cellar. the royal steward might command. She gets quite cross if it's merely room temperature. Simple shade and insulation also played their part. It sounds obvious, but just keeping things out of direct sunlight makes a huge difference. Food and drink would be stored in the shadiest, best ventilated parts of a dwelling. Containers might be wrapped in insulating materials like straw, reeds, or thick cloth to slow down the rate at which they absorbed ambient heat, especially if they had already been cooled by other means. It's crucial to understand the limitations of these methods. Evaporative cooling, night air cooling, and cellar storage can certainly make things pleasantly cool, especially in a very hot, dry climate. They can bring the temperature of a liquid down by several degrees. Celsius perhaps 515 or 1025 degree, depending on conditions below the ambient air temperature. This would be a significant and welcome relief. However, none of these methods can achieve freezing temperatures, or even temperatures close to freezing, unless the ambient night air itself dropped to near freezing, which would be exceptionally rare in most parts of Egypt. Even in winter, though, desert nights can get surprisingly cold. So, when we talk about chilled desserts in ancient Egypt, we're talking about something refreshingly cool, not something solidly frozen like modern ice cream or even a sorbet. This distinction is key to understanding the unlikely nature of their proto-ice cream. It wasn't ice, but it was the coolest sweet treat they could possibly engineer. The precise temperature reduction achievable and consistently maintained for food and drink through various combinations of evaporative cooling, night air exposure, and cellar storage in ancient Egypt is difficult to quantify exactly and likely varied considerably by season. Specific microenvironment e.g., humidity levels near the Nile versus drier inland areas, and the diligence of the servants involved. But even a modest cooling would have transformed a simple fruit puree or a honey-sweetened milky drink into a luxurious refreshment. It was the difference between a warm, cloying mouthful and a delightful palate-cleansing sensation. These chilling secrets, then, were the tools the ancient Egyptians had at their disposal. They were masters of working with their environment, using natural principles to achieve results that might seem simple to us, but were a testament to their keen observation and ingenuity. Now that we know how they could make things cool, and what sweet and dairy ingredients they had, we can start to imagine the kinds of chilled concoctions they might have actually created and, importantly, who would have had the privilege of enjoying them? The path to Pharaoh's frozen fantasy was paved with porous pots and a lot of patient fanning. We've now explored the ancient Egyptians' clever, if limited, methods for coaxing coolness from their sweltering environment, the porous earthenware jars, the strategic use of night air, and the dim refuge of cellars. These techniques could certainly make water, wine, or even a fruit puree pleasantly cool, a welcome respite from the desert heat. But when we start to entertain the idea of something even remotely akin to ice cream, even a very distant, rudimentary ancestor, we inevitably confront a colossal, shimmering obstacle: ice itself. In a land as famously hot and largely flat as Egypt, where would they get it? Could the pharaohs, with all their power and resources, truly have commanded the delivery of actual snow or ice to their desert palaces? This is where our quest for an Egyptian proto-ice cream ventures into the realm of extreme logistics and considerable scholarly skepticism. Let's be clear, for most of Egypt, particularly the Nile Valley, where the great cities like Memphis and Thebes flourished, natural ice formation would have been an impossibility, a phenomenon as alien as a blizzard in the Sahara. The winter temperatures simply didn't drop low enough for long enough to freeze bodies of water or produce lasting snow. So, if ice or snow was to be part of any ancient Egyptian refreshment, it had to come from somewhere else, somewhere far, far away. The most plausible, though still incredibly challenging, sources would have been distant mountains. Think of the peaks of Lebanon or Syria to the northeast, which do receive winter snows. Some have even speculated about ranges further afield. Imagine the undertaking harvesting compacted snow or ice from these remote mountain heights, packing it as densely as possible, insulating it with layers of straw, reeds, or thick animal hides, and then transporting it hundreds, perhaps even thousands of kilometers across scorching deserts and rugged terrain to reach the pharaoh's court. This wouldn't be a casual errand. It would be a monumental feat of organization, labor, and expense. It would require a sophisticated relay system of swift runners, or perhaps chariots where the terrain permitted, working in shifts day and night. Special way stations might have needed to be established along the route, perhaps with pre-dug pits or shaded structures where the precious cargo could be temporarily stored and re-insulated before the next leg of its perilous journey. Even with the best insulation available to them, the rate of melt would have been substantial. For every block of ice that started the journey, only a fraction, if any, might arrive at its destination. It's the kind of logistical nightmare that would make a modern-day delivery company weep into their GPS units. The royal snow shipment from Mount Hermon is delayed. Your Majesty, apparently, runner number 47 got heat stroke, and a band of desert nomads mistook the insulating straw for a very large, slightly damp haystack. What about mountains closer to home? Egypt does have mountainous regions, particularly in the Sinai Peninsula and the eastern desert flanking the Red Sea. Some of these peaks, like Mount Sinai Gebel Musa itself, can reach over 2,200 meters, 7,200 feet, and do occasionally receive a dusting of snow in winter, though it's rarely heavy or long-lasting. While some ancient civilizations, like the Persians under Cyrus the Great who built yakhals, ancient evaporative coolers that could also store winter ice, and later the Romans, did indeed transport snow from mountains, often over considerable distances, to cool drinks and create chilled delicacies, direct and unambiguous evidence for such large-scale or regular practice in pharaonic Egypt, especially for the purpose of chilling food rather than just high-status water as wine, is notably scarce or highly debated. The few, scattered instances of snow in Egypt's own higher desert regions would likely have been too unreliable and too difficult to access and transport in meaningful quantities to form the basis of any regular luxury night. It might have been a rare curiosity, a look what the storm brought us from the high desert moment, but not a dependable supply chain for the royal kitchens. The sheer cost and effort involved would have rendered any ice-cooled refreshment an extravagance of almost unimaginable proportions, reserved exclusively for the pharaoh and perhaps his innermost circle. It would have been less a food item and more a breathtaking display of power. The ability to command nature itself, to bring the cold of distant mountains into the heart of the desert. If it happened at all, it was likely an occasional, ostentatious marvel rather than a regular menu item. We have records of pharaohs importing exotic trees, animals, and other luxuries from faraway lands. A shipment of snow would have been the ultimate in conspicuous consumption. How would such precious, rapidly dwindling ice have been used, assuming a small quantity actually made it? It almost certainly wouldn't have been used to make ice cream in the sense of churning a dairy mixture while freezing it solid. That technology was millennia away. More likely, the ice or snow would have been crushed and used to rapidly chill wine or other beverages, a far more efficient use of its cooling power. A few slivers of ice in the pharaoh's wine cup would have been a sensation, or perhaps a small amount of crushed ice could have been mixed with fruit pulp, honey, or date syrup to create a very rudimentary slush or granita-like concoction. A fleeting, intensely cold, and incredibly luxurious mouthful. It would have been a taste of another world, a shocking, delightful contrast to the pervasive heat. A quirky or fringe tidbit that sometimes arises in discussions of ancient cooling is the idea that certain very deep, well-shaded well shafts or man-made grottos, particularly in arid regions with significant diurnal temperature variation, might have been able to trap cold night air so effectively that tiny amounts of hoarfrost or even thin slivers of ice could form during exceptionally cold desert nights. While this is theoretically possible under very specific microclimatic conditions, it would produce minuscule, highly localized quantities of ice. Certainly not enough for a dessert course at a royal banquet. It's more a curiosity of desert physics than a viable source of ice cream ingredients. The feasibility and extent of long-distance snow or ice transportation for consumption in ancient Egypt, particularly before the Hellenistic period when Greek influence brought new ideas and perhaps increased contact with regions more familiar with ice use, remains a significant point of discussion among historians and archaeologists, with most considering it highly improbable on a regular or substantial basis. The evidence from Egyptian texts and art simply doesn't shout ice. in the way it does for, say, bread or beer, while absence of evidence isn't absolute evidence of absence. The sheer logistical hurdles and the lack of clear corroboration make the regular use of transported mountain ice in pharaonic Egypt a very cool but very unlikely dream. So, while Pharaoh might have wished for a mountain of ice cream, he probably had to settle for a slightly chilled fig smoothie, fanned by a particularly enthusiastic servant. And honestly, that in that heat, even that would have felt like a gift from the gods. We've pondered the immense, almost insurmountable challenge of sourcing actual ice or snow in ancient Egypt. It seems that a truly frozen dessert, in the way we might imagine it, was likely beyond even the pharaoh's considerable reach on any regular basis. However, this doesn't mean that the desire for cool, refreshing treats didn't exist at the highest levels of Egyptian society. Quite the contrary. The pharaoh, a figure considered semi-divine, a god-king on earth, was entitled to every conceivable luxury, every exotic delight that the kingdom, and indeed the known world, could provide. If anyone was going to enjoy a specially prepared, refreshingly chilled delicacy, however it was achieved, it would be the ruler of the two lands. Let's imagine ourselves in the perfumed air of the royal court and consider the kinds of royal refreshments that might have graced the pharaoh's table. Driven by an elite craving for coolness, Egyptian pharaohs and the royal court lived in considerable luxury compared to the general population, with access to the finest foods, imported goods, and an extensive servant staff dedicated to their comfort and pleasure. Their palaces would have been oases of relative coolness, designed with the best available ventilation techniques, shaded courtyards, and perhaps even interior pools or fountains. Within these privileged spaces, the pursuit of sensory delight was a serious business. Feasts were elaborate, entertainment was sophisticated, and the presentation of food and drink was an art form. In such an environment, a chilled beverage or a cool, sweet mouthful would not just be a relief from the heat, it would be a statement of status, a testament to the pharaoh's power to command resources and achieve what was difficult or impossible for ordinary people. It's like having the only air-conditioned chariot in the entire kingdom. Everyone would notice. So, what kind of cold cravings might a pharaoh have had, while a mountain of snow might be a logistical fantasy? The desire for something cool would have been very real. We know they enjoyed wine, often extensively documented in tomb provisions and offering lists. Having that wine served refreshingly cool, rather than at the sweltering ambient temperature, would have been a significant mark of refinement. This is where those evaporative cooling techniques we discussed, the porous jars, the constant fanning, the night air exposure, the cellar storage, would have been employed with maximum diligence and on a grand scale for the royal household. The pharaoh wouldn't just have one servant fanning his wine jar, he'd have a whole team, a veritable ministry of cool beverages, ensuring that every sip was as refreshing as humanly possible in ancient Egypt. Is the royal grape juice at precisely 3 degrees below boiling magma, yet a stern vizier might inquire of a nervous wine chiller? The living Horus is feeling a trifle warm, beyond a chilled drinks. What about chilled foods? Given their love for fruits and honey, it's highly plausible that the royal kitchens experimented with creating cool fruit-based concoctions. Imagine fresh figs, dates, or pomegranates, perhaps grapes or melons, pounded into a rich pulp, sweetened with the finest honey, maybe flavored with a hint of an exotic spice if available. Cinnamon and cardamom were known in Egypt through trade. Though extremely rare and costly, this sweet, fragrant mush could then be subjected to the most intensive cooling methods available. Poured into porous earthenware bowls, set in the breeziest, shadiest part of the palace cellars, perhaps surrounded by other cooling jars or damp cloths, and fanned with unwavering dedication. The result wouldn't be frozen solid, but it could achieve a delightful coolness, a smooth, soothing texture, a world away from a warm, sticky fruit paste. This, perhaps, is where we find the true ancestor of an Egyptian ice cream, not ice, not cream in the modern sense, but a meticulously chilled, sweetened fruit delicacy fit for a god king. Consider specific pharaohs known for their opulence, their extensive building projects, or their far-reaching trade expeditions. rulers from the New Kingdom like Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who dispatched a famous trading mission to the land of Punt, Akhenaten, the religious reformer with his new capital at Amarna, the glittering boy king, Tutankhamun, whose tomb revealed such astonishing luxuries, or Rameses II, Rameses the Great, renowned for his monumental building and long reign. It's entirely speculative to link any specific ruler to a chilled dessert without direct evidence. However, it stands to reason that such powerful and wealthy monarchs, constantly seeking new ways to display their status and enjoy the fruits of their empire, would have been prime candidates for commissioning or appreciating such labor-intensive luxuries. If a new type of slightly cooler than usual fig paste could be invented, you can bet it would have made its debut at a royal banquet. Whether specific tomb depictions of food preparation or offering scenes among the elite implicitly suggest the use of advanced cooling techniques beyond simple evaporation, or even hint at the presence of actual ice, is a matter of ongoing iconographic interpretation and scholarly debate. Artists often depicted idealized scenes, and the exact nature of the food items can be ambiguous. However, the sheer variety of foodstuffs and the elaborate settings certainly point to a sophisticated culinary culture at the elite level, one that would have valued novelty and sensory pleasure. It's also possible that chilled items weren't just for pleasure but had other roles. Royal physicians, who were often highly learned individuals, might have prescribed cool concoctions or chilled liquids for certain ailments, particularly to reduce fevers or soothe inflammations. In a world without antibiotics, managing fever was a critical concern. Or perhaps certain temple rituals, especially those dedicated to sun deities like Ra or Aten, might have involved offerings of symbolically cool substances as a mark of profound respect or as a magical counterpoint to the god's fiery essence. Again, this is speculative, but it aligns with the Egyptian practice of offering the very best and most precious items to their gods. A cool fruit slush for the sun god. May it temper his divine heat and remind him that we, his humble servants, are basically melting down here. A quirky or fringe tidbit from some later Roman accounts, which may or may not reflect earlier Egyptian practices, mentions emperors who went to extraordinary lengths to procure snow or ice for their banquets, sometimes using it to chill fruits or create iced drinks. While these are Roman, not pharaonic examples, they illustrate the lengths to which ancient rulers in hot climates would go to achieve that rare sensation of cold. It shows the desire was there, even if the Egyptian means were more constrained. Perhaps some very late period, Ptolemaic Greek-ruled pharaohs, with their closer connections to the Hellenistic world, where ice use was more established in some elite circles, might have had more success in procuring or creating truly iced treats. But for the dynastic Egyptians of earlier times, cool was the height of ambition. The craving for royal refreshments, for that exclusive taste of coolness in a scorching land, would have driven the efforts of countless unseen hands. A subject we'll explore next. But for now, imagine the pharaoh, reclining on a cushioned couch in a shaded pavilion, a gentle breeze natural or man-made stirring the air. A servant approaches, bearing a small, ornate bowl. Inside is a smooth, cool, subtly sweet concoction, perhaps tasting of dates and honey, or the tartness of pomegranates. It's not ice cream, not by a long shot, but in that moment, in that place, it is the ultimate refreshment, a fleeting taste of paradise, a symbol of power and pleasure that only a living god could command. We've imagined the pharaoh, the pinnacle of Egyptian society, enjoying a refreshingly cool, sweet treat, a rare luxury in a sun-scorched land. But such a delicacy, however simple its ingredients might seem to us, wouldn't have materialized out of thin air, nor would it have been casually whipped up by a royal chef deciding to experiment. Behind every cooling mouthful, every artfully chilled concoction, lay a chain of human effort, a cascade of labor performed by countless, mostly anonymous, hands. To truly understand the unlikely origins of any ancient Egyptian chilled dessert, we must appreciate the immense human endeavor that would have been required to transform common ingredients into an uncommon luxury. This wasn't just about a recipe, it was about a system of procurement, processing, and painstaking cooling, all powered by human energy. Let's start with the cooling process itself, the very heart of what made these treats special. If we consider the most likely method, evaporative cooling using porous earthenware jars, this was far from a passive affair when pursued to its maximum effect for the elite. Yes, a jar left in a breeze would cool somewhat on its own. But to achieve the optimal, most noticeable chill, especially for a pharaoh's table, I would require constant attention. Ancient Egyptian society relied heavily on a large labor force, including farmers, craftsmen, and servants with slavery also existing, particularly for captives of war or those condemned for crimes, to support its agricultural production, monumental building projects, and the very comfortable lifestyle of the elite. Among these ranks would be servants whose specific task was to manage the cooling of beverages and liquid-based foods. Imagine teams of these servants. Some would be responsible for fetching fresh water, not just for drinking, but for wetting the outside of the cooling jars or the cloths wrapped around them, a process that would need to be repeated frequently as the water evaporated in the dry air. Others, as we've seen depicted in tomb paintings, would be tasked with fanning the jars for hours on end. This wasn't a gentle, leisurely wave of a pretty fan. It would be a steady, rhythmic effort, designed to maximize airflow over the wet surfaces and accelerate evaporation. It would be tiring, monotonous work, performed in the heat, all to achieve a few degrees of coolness for the contents of a single jar. If the pharaoh wanted his fig puree chilled for the evening banquet, the fanning might have started that very morning, or even the night before. It was a human-powered refrigerator, and the power was sweat and stamina. Are your arms tired yet, Nefer? Only another 6 hours of fanning this pot of date slurry? The living god expects it to be at precisely less warm than the inside of a freshly baked pyramid by sundown. Then there's the use of night air cooling and cellar storage. This, too, involved significant labor. Items to be cooled would need to be carefully carried to an exposed rooftop or courtyard at dusk, arranged to catch the coolest breezes, and then retrieved before the morning sun could undo all the night's good work. If cellars were used, imagine servants descending into those cool, dim spaces, carrying heavy jars or bowls, arranging them for optimal chilling, and then bringing them up again when required. The cellars themselves would need to be maintained, kept clean, and perhaps even periodically ventilated in a controlled manner. Now, if we entertain the highly speculative for pharaonic Egypt scenario of transported snow or ice from distant mountains, the labor involved skyrockets into the realm of the almost unbelievable. Harvesting the snow or ice, often from treacherous mountain slopes. Compressing it, wrapping it in layers of insulating straw, reeds, or animal hides, loading it onto the backs of human porters, or if the terrain allowed. Pack animals. Then the grueling, relentless journey, a race against the sun, with teams of runners or riders working in relays, day and night. Each way station would require staff to receive the melting cargo, perhaps repack it with fresh insulation, and dispatch it with the next team. The mortality rate among these ice runners, facing desert heat, bandits, and sheer exhaustion, must have been appalling. All this for a luxury that would melt away in hours, if not minutes, once it reached its destination. It would be the ancient Egyptian equivalent of sending 1,000 men on a quest for a single, perfect snowflake. Beyond the cooling itself, consider the kitchen staff involved in preparing the base concoctions before any chilling took place. Fruits like dates, figs, or pomegranates didn't just magically puree themselves. They had to be sorted, washed, pitted, peeled, or seeded. This was meticulous, often sticky, hand labor. If nuts were included, they had to be shelled and chopped. Honey, the precious sweetener, had to be carefully measured and mixed. If dairy was used, perhaps fresh milk skimmed for its richer top layer, or fermented milk products. This too involved earlier stages of milking, churning or curdling, all labor-intensive. Ingredients might need to be ground with stone mortars and pestles, or strained through linen cloth to achieve a smoother texture. The royal kitchens would have been a hive of activity, with specialized cooks and numerous attendants, all working to prepare the diverse dishes for the pharaoh's table, including any experimental chilled treats. The sheer number of people involved in producing even a small bowl of a refreshingly cool fruit puree for a single individual like the pharaoh underscores the vast social and economic disparities of ancient Egyptian society. While the common farmer or laborer toiled under the sun, subsisting on a simple diet of bread, beer, and onions, the elite had access to resources and manpower that could literally bend the elements, or at least make them slightly less oppressive. These chilled luxuries were not just about taste or comfort, they were potent symbols of power, of the ability to command human labor on a grand scale for even the most fleeting of pleasures. The anonymity of these workers is also striking. We know the names of pharaohs, queens, and high officials from their monumental inscriptions and lavish tombs. But the countless servants who fanned the wine jars, the porters who might have hypothetically carried snow, the kitchen hands who pitted the dates, their names, their stories, their daily struggles are largely lost to history. Yet their labor was the invisible foundation upon which these luxuries were built. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that payment records for workers on royal projects, such as the tomb builders at Deir el Medina, meticulously list their rations, typically bread, beer, onions, some fish, and occasionally dates or other small supplements. There's no mention of them receiving chilled delicacies or imported snow. This highlights the chasm between the provisions for essential labor and the indulgences of the ruling class. A servant getting to even taste a leftover spoonful of the pharaoh's chilled fruit mush would have been an exceptionally rare and memorable event, probably whispered about for weeks. I swear, I saw Merritt sneak a lick of the royal pomegranate slush, the audacity. Also, how was it good? Even the boring logistics behind these treats involved human effort. The potters who crafted the porous earthenware jars essential for evaporative cooling, the farmers who cultivated the date palms and harvested the fruit, the beekeepers who tended the hives and extracted the honey, the miners or traders who sourced any exotic spices. Every ingredient, every tool had its own supply chain, all powered by human hands. So, as you imagine that ancient Egyptian chilled delight, remember the unseen army that made it possible? It was a luxury born not just of clever techniques, but of a social structure that could mobilize and direct vast amounts of human energy towards the comfort and pleasure of a select few. The coolness of the treat was directly proportional to the sweat of the many. We've established the intense desire for coolness in ancient Egypt, explored the sweeteners and dairy they had, and marveled at their ingenious, if limited, cooling methods, all underpinned by a vast amount of human labor, especially for any royal refreshment. But now we come to the tantalizing and somewhat frustrating core of our inquiry: what exactly were these chilled concoctions? If an ancient Egyptian scribe had decided to jot down the recipe for Pharaoh's favorite cool dessert, what might that papyrus have contained? Unfortunately, detailed culinary recipe books from pharaonic Egypt are exceedingly rare, if they existed at all in a systematic way. Much of what we understand about their cuisine comes from tomb paintings depicting food offerings, from lists of provisions for the afterlife, from archaeological remains of actual foodstuffs, and from later Greek and Roman accounts that sometimes describe Egyptian practices. So, when it comes to reconstructing their ice cream ancestors, we are largely in the realm of educated guesses, piecing together plausible combinations based on available ingredients and known technologies. Let's become culinary archaeologists for a moment and try to imagine what these ancient chilled treats might have been like. First and foremost, given the ingredients most readily available and the cooling methods we've discussed, primarily evaporative cooling, night air, and cellar storage, which achieve coolness rather than true freezing. The most plausible candidates for ancient Egyptian chilled desserts would be fruit-based. Possibility number 1, chilled fruit purees or thick juices. Imagine the ripest, sweetest fruits of the Nile Valley: dates, figs, grapes, pomegranates, perhaps melons, being meticulously prepared. The dates and figs might be stoned and pounded into a smooth, rich paste. Grapes could be pressed for their juice, pomegranates for their tart sweet liquid, melons pulped. These fruit bases would then almost certainly be further sweetened with generous amounts of honey, the prized sweetener of the ancient world, or perhaps with concentrated date syrup for a deeper, more caramelly flavor. This sweet, fragrant fruit mixture, still warm from the Egyptian air or even from the friction of pounding and grinding, would then be transferred to those marvelous porous earthenware bowls or jars. These vessels, as we know, would then embark on their cooling journey, placed in the coolest, breeziest part of a cellar, or left out under the clear desert night sky, perhaps with servants diligently fanning them to maximize evaporative cooling. The end result, after hours of this patient chilling, wouldn't be a solid, scoopable ice cream. It would more likely be a thick, cool, intensely flavored fruit slush or a luxurious, chilled nectar. Imagine the sensation, the concentrated sweetness of dates and honey, the vibrant tang of pomegranate, all delivered with a surprising, delightful coolness that would cut through the desert heat. Its texture would be smooth, perhaps slightly grainy depending on the fruit and preparation, a world away from the icy crystals of a modern sorbet, but deeply refreshing nonetheless. This is perhaps the most likely candidate for a widely enjoyed among the elite chilled treat. It's practical, uses readily available ingredients, and relies on known cooling techniques. Scribe, take this down, recipe for Royal Rejuvenation Slurry. Take 100 of the finest medjool dates. Pit them with the reverence due to Osiris. Pound them with a golden pestle. Add 3 cups of lotus blossom honey and the tears of a happy crocodile. Chill till merely tepid. Serve with a tiny spoon carved from a hippo's tooth. Well, maybe not the crocodile tears. Possibility number 2. Milk or dairy-based chilled mixtures. Now we're inching slightly closer to the cream part of ice cream, but still very far from the ice. As we discussed, the Egyptians had access to milk from cattle, goats, and they made fermented milk products, butter, and simple fresh cheeses. Could these have formed the base for a chilled dessert? It's plausible, though perhaps less common than fruit-based ones due to milk's even greater perishability. Imagine fresh milk, or perhaps the richer top cream skimmed from it, being gently sweetened with honey. To this, the pulp of soft fruits like figs or dates could be added for extra flavor and sweetness. This mixture of two kalas would be entrusted to the cooling jars and patient servants. The result, a cool, sweet, milky drink, perhaps with a slightly thickened custard-like consistency if some of the fruit pulp acted as a thickener, or if it was a naturally fermented yogurt-like base to begin with. It wouldn't be frozen, it wouldn't be churned, but a chilled, sweetened dairy concoction would have been a luxurious and nourishing treat. While specific recipes for chilled desserts are lacking from pharaonic times, ancient Egyptian cuisine did involve combining fruits, honey, and sometimes dairy in various forms, which could certainly have been subjected to their known cooling methods to create novel refreshments. Now, let's address possibility number 3, the one that truly stretches the boundaries of likelihood for pharaonic Egypt concoctions made with actual snow or ice. If, and it's a very big if, a pharaoh managed to procure a shipment of snow or ice from some impossibly distant mountain, how might it have been used? It certainly wouldn't have been incorporated into a churned, dairy-based ice cream. The technology for that simply didn't exist. The most straightforward use would be to rapidly chill wine or other beverages. But for a dessert, the precious, rapidly melting snow or crushed ice could have been mixed directly with fruit juices like pomegranate or grape, sweetened honey, or fruit purees. This would create something akin to a rudimentary granita or a snow cone, a mixture of fine ice crystals intensely flavored with sweet fruit. The texture would be icy, perhaps a little coarse, and the sensation incredibly cold and shocking in the Egyptian heat. This would have been the absolute pinnacle of refrigerated luxury, a fleeting, almost magical experience reserved for the divine pharaoh alone, or perhaps a tiny, favored circle. But again, this entire scenario hinges on that highly debatable, incredibly costly, and logistically nightmarish procurement of ice. It's important to emphasize the likely textures and flavors we're not talking about smooth, creamy, aerated modern ice cream. We're imagining desserts that were cool rather than frozen solid, with textures ranging from a thick liquid or slurry to a soft, cool pudding. Or, in the most extreme and speculative ice-based scenario, a coarse, fruit-flavored snow. The flavors would be intense and natural, the deep sweetness of dates, the floral notes of honey, the bright tang of indigenous fruits. Spices like cinnamon or cardamom, though known through trade, were exceptionally rare and expensive, and whether they would have been wasted on a chilled dessert, as opposed to being used in incense medicine or very high-status savory dishes, is uncertain. Simplicity and the purity of natural fruit and honey flavors likely dominated. A quirky or fringe tidbit from some medical papyri is the mention of using cool or cold substances and preparations for treating certain ailments, such as reducing fevers or soothing inflammations. While these aren't dessert recipes, they do hint at a broader familiarity with the concept of creating and applying cooled edible or potable items for specific purposes, beyond just general refreshment. Perhaps a physician might prescribe a chilled date and honey mash for a feverish patient in the royal household, reconstructing ancient Egyptian culinary practices, especially for ephemeral luxury items like chilled desserts that leave little direct archaeological trace beyond their basic ingredients, relies heavily on indirect evidence from art, tomb offerings, analysis of pottery residues, and comparative ethnography from regions with similar climates and historical food traditions. This leaves many specific recipes firmly in the realm of educated speculation. We can imagine the possibilities. We can test them with modern recreations using only anciently available ingredients and methods, but we can rarely say with absolute certainty. This is exactly how Pharaoh Tutankhamun enjoyed his chilled fig delight. But the fun and the sleepy historical exploration lies in that very act of imagining, of trying to taste the past, even its coolest, most unlikely corners. Perhaps there's a lost papyrus out there, a pharaoh's frozen favorites, just waiting to be discovered? Until then, we dream in chilled honey and dates. We've journeyed through the hypothetical royal kitchens and cellars of ancient Egypt, imagining the pharaohs and their elite enjoying subtly chilled fruit purees or honey-sweetened milky concoctions, all made possible by ingenious cooling methods and a great deal of human labor. These would have been earthly delights, symbols of status and luxury. But in a civilization as deeply religious as ancient Egypt, where the gods permeated every aspect of existence, it's natural to wonder, did these chilled treats, these precious tastes of coolness, also find a place in the divine realm were cool offerings ever made to the gods? And if so, what might that have signified? Let's gently explore the possibility of divine desserts and ritual refreshments in the land of the pharaohs. Ancient Egyptians made extensive daily offerings of food and drink to their gods in temples, believing that the gods consumed the spiritual essence cow of these offerings, which were then often reverted to the temple priest for their physical consumption, a divine catering service with excellent perks for the staff. These offerings were not just symbolic gestures, they were seen as essential for maintaining Mashat cosmic order and justice, for nourishing the gods, and for ensuring their continued benevolence towards Egypt. The offering tables in the inner sanctums of temples would be laden with the finest provisions the land could produce: loaves of bread in myriad shapes, joints of roasted meat, trussed fowl, overflowing baskets of fresh fruits like figs, dates, and grapes, jars of wine and beer, and precious honey and incense. The quality and abundance of these offerings reflected the piety of the pharaoh who was the chief priest of every god and the wealth of the temple. Given this tradition of offering the best of the best, could chilled or specially cooled items have been among these divine provisions, particularly for major deities or in the grand temples of Thebes, Memphis, or Heliopolis? If coolness was such a prized luxury for humans in the Egyptian heat, it stands to reason that offering a cool refreshment to a god would be seen as an act of profound reverence and an exceptional gift. Imagine a priest in the cool, shadowy interior of a temple sanctuary, presenting a bowl of meticulously chilled fruit nectar to the cult statue of Ra, the mighty sun god himself. Would this cool offering be seen as a particularly pleasing counterpoint to Ra's own fiery essence, a way of soothing or honoring his solar power? Or perhaps to Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, music, and pleasure, would a delightful, cool, sweet treat be an especially appropriate offering to a deity so closely associated with sensory joy, a chilled pomegranate slush for Lady Hathor? The high priest might intone, "May it bring a cool smile to her divine countenance, and perhaps inspire a slightly less chaotic festival next time." The practicalities, of course, are a challenge. How would a chilled item be presented and maintained as cool on an offering table within a temple, even for the relatively short duration of a ritual? The temples themselves, with their massive stone walls and often limited direct sunlight in the inner sanctums, would have been naturally cooler than the outside world. The same evaporative cooling techniques used in palaces, porous vessels, perhaps fanned by temple attendants, could theoretically have been employed for divine offerings as well. The coolness might be fleeting, but the act of offering it, the intention, and the effort would be what mattered. The gods, after all, were thought to consume the essence, not necessarily the physical substance in its exact earthly state. So, the idea of coolness, the symbolic offering of relief from the heat, might have been as important as the actual temperature achieved. We don't have explicit offering lists from papyri or temple inventories that specifically itemize chilled date paste or snow-cooled wine for the gods in pharaonic Egypt. Such a level of detail in that particular respect is generally missing. However, offering lists do frequently mention high-quality fruits, honey, milk, and wine, all the base ingredients we've been discussing. If the pharaoh was enjoying these items chilled, it's a logical extension to think that he might command the same special preparation for the gods he so fervently worshipped and depended upon. Beyond daily temple offerings, consider mortuary offerings, the vast quantities of food, drink, and luxury goods placed in tombs to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. Pharaohs and nobles were equipped for eternity with everything they enjoyed in life. While it's unlikely that an actual chilled dessert could be preserved in a tomb for millennia, the means of chilling wouldn't transfer to the afterlife. The ingredients for such treats were certainly included. Jars of honey, baskets of dates and figs, wine vessels, all were standard provisions. Perhaps more importantly, tomb paintings often depicted lush gardens, bountiful harvests, and scenes of feasting, representing an idealized eternal existence. In this perfect afterlife, free from the imperfections of the earthly realm, perhaps the deceased could magically enjoy their favorite fruit nectars at a perpetually perfect, cool temperature. The tomb of Nakht in Thebes, for example, has beautiful scenes of agricultural abundance and feasting, a vision of eternal paradise where every desire, perhaps even for a cool drink, would be met. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some temple rituals involve the ceremonial libation of cool water, often drawn from sacred temple lakes or wells. This water wasn't just for drinking by the priests, it was used in purification rites, sprinkled to sanctify spaces, and offered to deities symbolizing life, purity, and the refreshing coolness of the primeval waters of Nun from which all creation arose. Could this established ritual use of cool water have occasionally extended to other specially cooled liquid offerings, like chilled wine or fruit juice? If the occasion was grand enough or the deity important enough, it's a subtle step, but not an implausible one within their symbolic framework. Whether specific ritual texts or iconographic representations of temple offerings contain veiled references to specially cooled food or drink for deities. Beyond the general high quality and freshness of consecrated provisions is a subtle area of Egyptological research that requires careful interpretation. Most scholars would likely agree that the primary emphasis was on the type and quality of the food item itself, rather than its temperature, given the technological limitations. However, the desire to offer the utmost luxury and the known methods for achieving at least some degree of coolness leave a small, intriguing window open for the possibility of divine desserts having a chilled aspect, at least in intention, for the most important gods or on the most solemn occasions. So, while we may not find a hieroglyphic recipe for Amun-Ra's ambrosial ice treat, the logic of Egyptian religious practice, offering the best, honoring the gods with luxury, and the symbolic power of coolness in a hot land, suggests that if such chilled delicacies were being created for the pharaoh, the gods would have been considered equally, if not more, deserving of such rare and refreshing kindnesses. It's a comforting thought, perhaps, that even the mighty sun god might have appreciated a cool sip on a particularly blazing celestial afternoon. I understand you're looking to continue with the script. In the previous turn, I provided sections 6 through 10. Assuming you intended to ask for the next set of sections to complete the main body of the script, I will now proceed with sections 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, followed by the final wind down. This will take us to the end of our sleepy exploration of ice cream's unlikely origins in ancient Egypt. If you did indeed want me to repeat section 10 for some reason, please let me know after this response. For now, Let's focus on what these ancient chilled treats truly might have been. We've journeyed through the intense heat of ancient Egypt. Imagine the pharaohs' desire for coolness, explored their natural sweeteners and dairy resources, marveled at their ingenious cooling methods, and even pondered the immense labor and hypothetical logistics of sourcing actual ice. After all this, it's time to consolidate our thoughts and arrive at the most plausible picture of what an ancient Egyptian proto-ice cream truly was. Given the immense challenges of obtaining and using actual ice, and the state of their dairy processing, the most likely candidate for these coveted chilled delicacies was overwhelmingly fruit-based, and merely chilled to a refreshing coolness, rather than being frozen solid like modern ice cream or even a true sorbet. Let's gently solidify this understanding, focusing on the realistic achievements of Egyptian culinary ingenuity. The stars of this ancient chilled show were undoubtedly the abundant fruits of the Nile Valley. Imagine those luscious dates, with their deep, caramel-like sweetness, or sun-ripened figs, bursting with sugary pulp. Picture bowls of juicy grapes, tart pomegranates with their jewel-like arils, or refreshing melons. These were the readily available, naturally sweet treasures that formed the foundation of most Egyptian desserts. Fruit was a significant part of the ancient Egyptian diet and featured prominently in desserts and offerings, often sweetened further with honey, their primary concentrated sweetener. The preparation of these fruits for a chilled treat would have been straightforward. Relying on manual labor, fruits would be meticulously washed, pitted, peeled, or seeded as necessary. They might then be mashed or pounded into a smooth puree, or pressed to extract their rich juice. Think of a thick, fragrant fig paste or a vibrant pomegranate nectar. To enhance the natural sweetness, generous amounts of honey, that liquid gold of the ancient world, or concentrated date syrup would be lovingly stirred in. The resulting mixture would be intensely sweet, a pure taste of the Egyptian sun, but still, at this stage, warm from the ambient air and the effort of preparation. Then came the crucial step, the one that transformed a simple sweet fruit mash into a sought-after luxury, the cooling. This is where the Egyptians' cleverness with their environment came into play. The sweet fruit concoction would be poured into those special porous earthenware jars or bowls we've discussed. These vessels would then be placed in the coolest, shadiest, breeziest spot available, perhaps a dedicated cellar, a north-facing alcove, or even just under a well-ventilated awning. For truly elite preparations, servants would likely be assigned to continuously fan these jars, or to keep their outer surfaces damp, maximizing the evaporative cooling effect. Alternatively, the mixture could be left out overnight, covered lightly, to benefit from the significant drop in desert night temperatures. What would the texture and experience of consuming such a treat be? It certainly wouldn't be the firm, scoopable or crystalline structure of ice cream or sorbet that we know. Instead, you'd have something delightfully cool, perhaps the consistency of a very thick, chilled smoothie, a luxurious, almost drinkable fruit slush, or a soft, spoonable, cool fruit paste. It would be a relief, a soothing sensation on a palate accustomed to the desert heat. The coolness itself, even if only a few degrees below the ambient temperature, would be the primary marvel. The flavors would be direct and intense, the pure, unadulterated taste of sun-ripened fruit and rich honey, unmarred by artificial flavors or complex chemical stabilizers. It was nature's sweetness, simply made cooler. This focus on chilled fruit preparations as the most plausible form of Egyptian proto-ice cream helps to ground our expectations and appreciate their achievements within the context of their technological limitations. While the pharaoh might have dreamt of mountains of actual ice, the reality for even the highest elite was likely a more modest, but no less valued Masa's form of refreshment. It wasn't about defying nature by creating solid frost in the desert, but about working with nature, using the principles of evaporation and radiative cooling to coax a delightful coolness from readily available ingredients. A quirky or fringe tidbit that supports the idea of consuming such semi-liquid treats is the presence in some tomb depictions of individuals drinking from bowls or cups, using what appear to be reeds or tubes, essentially ancient straws. Such an implement would be perfectly suited for sipping a thick, chilled fruit nectar or a smooth, cool puree, especially if one wanted to savor it slowly and elegantly. Imagine a noble lady at a banquet, delicately sipping her chilled fig and honey slurry through a fine reed, the height of sophisticated refreshment. Darling, this chilled date mush is simply divine, and my drinking reed has such a delightful papyrusy aftertaste. The precise consistency and range of these ancient Egyptian chilled fruit preparations, whether more like a thick juice, a smooth puree that one might eat with a small spoon, or perhaps even a slightly jellied compote if certain fruits with natural pectins were used and allowed to set while cooling, likely varied and is not easily determined from the available archaeological or artistic evidence. There was probably a spectrum of textures, depending on the fruit, the amount of liquid added, and the desired end result. But the common denominator would have been that welcome, surprising coolness. So, when we speak of the unlikely origins of ice cream in ancient Egypt, what we're truly celebrating is their mastery in creating these delightful, fruit-based chilled concoctions. It was the coolness itself, applied to the already delicious sweet fruits of their land, that constituted the luxury and the pleasure. This, in the scorching heat of the Nile Valley, was Egypt's truest, most achievable ice cream, a testament to their ingenuity and their enduring desire for a sweet, cool escape. It wasn't about conquering the cold, but about wooing it, gently, patiently, with porous pots and a lot of fanning. Having established that ancient Egypt's most plausible proto-ice cream was likely a delicious, fruit-based concoction, meticulously chilled rather than truly frozen. Let's now turn our attention to how such a rare and refreshing treat might have been presented and consumed. The experience of a luxury item isn't just about its intrinsic qualities, it's also about the ceremony, the setting, and the very vessels from which it's enjoyed. For the pharaohs and the elite of Egyptian society, the serving of any food, especially a prized delicacy like a chilled sweet, would have been an art form in itself, designed to enhance its exclusivity and pleasure. Imagine the scene: a royal banquet is in progress, or perhaps the pharaoh is relaxing in a shaded palace garden on a sweltering afternoon. The moment arrives for a special refreshment. How would this cool delight make its appearance? The vessels used would undoubtedly be of the finest quality available. While everyday Egyptians used simple, utilitarian pottery, the elite, and certainly the pharaoh, had access to beautifully crafted tableware. Your chilled fruit puree or nectar might be served in bowls or cups made of brightly colored Egyptian faience, a quartz-based ceramic renowned for its vibrant blue and green glazes, often decorated with intricate patterns or hieroglyphs. Faience, with its smooth, cool surface, would have been aesthetically pleasing and perhaps even helped to maintain the coolness of its contents for a short while. Alternatively, or for even higher status, the treat might be presented in vessels carved from polished stone, such as alabaster. Alabaster, with its translucent, creamy white appearance, was a favorite material for luxury items in ancient Egypt, including bowls, jars, and cups. Stone, being a relatively good insulator, might also have helped to preserve the coolness of the dessert a little longer than simple pottery, especially if the stone vessel itself had been pre-chilled in a cellar. And for the ultimate display of wealth and power, the pharaoh himself might have enjoyed his chilled refreshment from a cup or chalice wrought from precious metal, gold or silver. Such vessels are often depicted in scenes of royal life and have been found in royal tombs, like that of Tutankhamun. Drinking a cool and sweet fruit nectar from a golden goblet, that's a level of luxury that truly speaks of divine kingship. Make sure my chilled pomegranate juice is served in the sun god's personal golden sippy cup today. Chief steward, and no fingerprints. What about utensils if the concoction was more of a thick liquid or a very smooth slush? It might have been sipped directly from the cup or bowl, perhaps using those reed straws we speculated about earlier. If it had a slightly thicker, more spoonable consistency, like a cool fruit paste or a very soft pudding, then spoons would have been used. Ancient Egyptian spoons were typically made of wood, ivory, or metal bronze, silver or gold for the elite. Some were quite simple, while others were elaborately carved, with handles shaped like unks, lotus flowers, or even human figures. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some ornate spoons recovered from ancient Egypt, particularly from the New Kingdom, feature very long, slender handles, sometimes with a swivel mechanism at the bowl. While their exact primary use is debated, cosmetic purposes or for reaching into deep unguent jars are often suggested. It's fun to imagine such an elegant implement being used to leisurely scoop up a precious, chilled delicacy from a deep bowl, allowing for a more refined and perhaps slightly theatrical consumption. It would certainly add to the ceremony. The setting for enjoying such a treat would also contribute to the experience. At a grand banquet, it might be served as a special interlude or a final sweet course, a surprising and welcome contrast to the richer, warmer dishes. In a more intimate setting, the pharaoh might enjoy it in a private, shaded garden pavilion, surrounded by lotus pools and fragrant flowers, the coolness of the dessert enhanced by the relative coolness of the immediate environment. The portion sizes were likely small. Given the considerable effort involved in the chilling process and the richness of the ingredients, concentrated fruit, sugars, and honey, this wasn't something to be consumed in vast quantities like a modern pint of ice cream. It was a precious treat to be savored slowly, each cool mouthful a small miracle in the desert heat. It might have been served alongside other fresh fruits, perhaps a few choice dates or figs, or even some small, delicate honey cakes, offering a contrast in textures and temperatures. The ritual of serving itself would have been important. High-ranking servants, or perhaps even trusted courtiers, would present the chilled delicacy with due ceremony, emphasizing its rarity and the pharaoh's privilege in enjoying it. Every detail, from the choice of vessel to the manner of presentation, would underscore its status as a luxury item. And then, of course, the fleeting nature of the coolness was an inherent part of the experience. Without ongoing refrigeration, a chilled treat, once removed from its cooling environment, the cellar, the fanned porous jar would begin to warm up relatively quickly in the Egyptian heat. This meant it had to be consumed with a certain immediacy, adding to its preciousness. It wasn't something you could put back in the freezer for later. This ephemeral quality might even have enhanced its appeal, a delightful, transient pleasure to be enjoyed in the moment. The mainstream historical fact here is that ancient Egyptian elite, including pharaohs and nobles, used a wide variety of finely crafted bowls, cups, and spoons made from materials like faience, alabaster, diorite, and precious metals for their meals and banquets, reflecting their wealth and sophisticated tastes. These weren't just functional items, they were works of art that elevated the act of eating and drinking. Whether there were specific, dedicated types of serving vessels used exclusively for chilled delicacies in ancient Egypt, or if existing fine tableware was simply employed for this purpose as well, is not clearly discernible from the archaeological record alone. It's more likely the latter, the finest available dishes would be used for the finest and coolest treats. So, as you picture this ancient ice cream ancestor being served, don't imagine a brightly colored frozen scoop in a cone. Instead, visualize an elegant, perhaps translucent alabaster bowl, holding a small portion of a cool, glistening fruit puree, subtly fragrant with honey and dates. A servant presents it with a bow. The pharaoh takes a delicate carved ivory spoon. The first mouthful is a shock of coolness, a wave of intense, natural sweetness. It's a moment of pure, unadulterated luxury, a testament to the ingenuity and power that could conjure such a sensation from the heart of the desert. And you'd definitely want to eat it before it turned back into just slightly less warm fruit mush under the gaze of Rai. We've spent a good while now immersed in the hot sands and cool dreams of ancient Egypt, piecing together how they might have created their own unique, chilled delicacies. But to truly appreciate Egypt's unlikely achievement, and to understand its place in the broader story of frozen desserts, it's helpful to cast our gaze, just for a little while, beyond the banks of the Nile and see what other ancient civilizations were up to in the global quest for coolness. You'll find that the desire for a refreshing escape from the heat was universal, but the methods and the results varied greatly depending on geography, climate, and technological development. Egypt, with its distinct lack of readily available natural ice, faced a unique set of challenges. But other empires, blessed with nearby snowy mountains or different technological insights, were perhaps a few steps ahead on the path to truly frozen treats. One of the most significant early innovators in the world of frozen desserts was undoubtedly ancient Persia. Long before modern refrigeration, the Persians, particularly during the Achaemenid Empire starting around 550 BCE, developed remarkable techniques for both harvesting and storing ice. They had access to snow and ice from the high mountain ranges that bordered their vast empire. During the winter months, ice would be collected from these mountains, or even formed in shallow pools at high altitudes during freezing nights. This precious commodity was then transported, often over considerable distances, and stored in ingenious structures called yakhchels. A yakhchel, literally ice pit, was a type of ancient evaporative cooler, often a large conical beehive-shaped structure made of thick, heat-resistant mud brick with a deep underground storage space. These were so effective at insulating and maintaining low temperatures that ice stored in winter could often last through the scorching summer months. Ancient Persians are credited with developing these sophisticated methods for storing ice and are believed to have created early forms of frozen desserts using this mountain snow or stored ice, often mixed with fruit syrups, honey, and flavorings like rosewater or saffron. This is a significant step beyond what was likely achievable in pharaonic Egypt. The Persians are often associated with a dessert that might be considered a true ancestor of sorbet or even some types of ice cream faluda. While the modern version of faluda often involves thin vermicelli-like starch noodles mixed with a semi-frozen rosewater and lime syrup, its earliest forms were likely simpler, perhaps just sweetened fruit juices or syrups poured over crushed ice or snow. Imagine a Persian king in his opulent palace at Persepolis enjoying a bowl of fragrant, icy rosewater slush, a far cry from a merely chilled Egyptian fruit puree, and a testament to their mastery of ice technology. Moving westward, the ancient Romans, particularly during the height of the empire, also developed a taste for iced luxuries, though they mostly relied on imported snow rather than sophisticated long-term ice storage like the Persians. Wealthy Romans, including emperors like Nero who reigned from 54 to 68 CE, were known to dispatch teams of swift runners to fetch snow and ice from distant mountains, such as the Apennines or even the Alps. This snow would then be rushed back to Rome, insulated as best as possible, and used to cool wine or mixed with honey, fruit juices, and pulp to create chilled treats. It was an extravagant display of wealth and power, much like our hypothetical pharaoh's chilled delight, but with the distinct advantage of actual frozen water. Seneca, the Roman philosopher and Nero's tutor, even grumbled about the decadent youth who pile up snow in a platter and give it different flavors, suggesting such practices were becoming a fashionable indulgence. No word on whether Nero fiddled while his snow melted, but he certainly enjoyed his cool refreshments. If we look to the east, ancient China also has a long history of chilled and frozen desserts. Texts from as early as the Shang dynasty around 1600–1046 BCE mention methods for storing ice in winter for summer use, typically in insulated ice cellars. During the Tang dynasty 6–18 907 CE, a period of great cultural and culinary sophistication, records suggest the creation of frozen confections made from milk, often from cows, goats, or even water buffalo, flour and camphor and aromatic, which were then packed in snow and ice to freeze. Some scholars see these as very early precursors to milk-based ice cream. The famed traveler Marco Polo, in the 13th century, was said to have brought back recipes for water ices from China to Italy, though this claim is debated by food historians. Regardless of Polo's role, China clearly had its own independent tradition of enjoying frozen treats. Now, comparing these achievements with what we've discussed for ancient Egypt highlights the unlikely nature of finding true ice cream there. Egypt lacked both the readily accessible high mountains with abundant, lasting snow like Persia or the Alps for Rome, and the consistently cold winters that might allow for natural ice harvesting and storage as in parts of China. Their genius lay in maximizing coolness through evaporative methods, which, while effective for chilling, simply couldn't produce the freezing temperatures needed for ice-based desserts. This isn't to diminish Egyptian ingenuity. In fact, it makes their achievements in creating any kind of cool refreshment in such a climate even more remarkable. They were working with a far more challenging environmental hand. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Alexander the Great, during his campaigns that took him into Persia and India in the 4th century BCE, was said to have enjoyed snow flavored with honey and nectar. He reportedly had trenches dug and filled with snow, insulated with oak branches to preserve it for his troops and for his own refreshment. This illustrates how the idea of using snow for cooling and for creating simple ice treats was known in the wider ancient world, and how military campaigns could sometimes facilitate the spread of such practices, at least among the elite. Egypt, after Alexander's conquest and during the subsequent Ptolemaic Greek dynasty, would have had increased exposure to these Hellenistic and Persian customs, possibly leading to more ambitious attempts at iced delicacies if snow or ice could be imported or its effects simulated more effectively. The precise chronology and lines of influence for early ice cooling and frozen dessert technologies between these ancient civilizations, Persia, China, Greece, Rome, and potentially others, are complex and still debated by food historians. It's likely there were independent innovations as well as cross-cultural exchanges through trade, warfare, and travel. What is clear is that the human desire for a cool, sweet treat in warm weather was a powerful motivator for ingenuity across the ancient world. So, while the ancient Egyptians were masterfully chilling their fruit nectars in porous pots, their contemporaries in Persia might have been enjoying a true snow cone, and the Chinese might have been experimenting with frozen milk. It places Egypt's efforts in a global context. They were pioneers in the art of chilling with limited resources, even if the true ice age of desserts dawned more brightly elsewhere. And that, in itself, is a cool piece of history. We've journeyed from the scorching sun of the Egyptian desert to the cool, hypothetical refreshment of a pharaoh's chilled fruit puree. We've peeked into the kitchens of Persia, Rome, and China to see how other ancient cultures tackled the universal desire for a cold, sweet treat, often with the distinct advantage of accessible mountain snow or ice. Now, as our sleepy exploration nears its end, it's time to state a crucial, if perhaps by now, obvious distinction. The ancient Egyptian chilled delicacies we've been imagining, however luxurious and ingenious for their time, were not modern ice cream. Not even close. Understanding this difference is key to appreciating both what the Egyptians did achieve and the long, fascinating journey that eventually led to the frozen desserts we know and love today. This is where the boring history aspect really shines, in its commitment to accuracy over romantic fancy. Let's break down the key differences. The most fundamental element, of course, lies in freezing technology. Modern ice cream, sorbet, gelato, they all rely on achieving and maintaining temperatures well below the freezing point of water 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. This is accomplished today with sophisticated electric freezers and in earlier centuries through the use of ice mixed with salt like saltpeter to create an endothermic reaction that dramatically lowers the temperature of a brine bath, allowing a mixture to be frozen while being churned. Ancient Egyptians lacked any form of artificial refrigeration and, as we've discussed at length, likely had extremely limited, if any, access to natural ice or snow on a regular basis. Their cooling methods, evaporative cooling, night air exposure, cellar storage, were brilliant for making things pleasantly cool, but they simply could not produce the sub-zero temperatures needed to freeze water, let alone a sweetened dairy or fruit mixture into a solid, scoopable mass. Their chilled treats were cool, not frozen. Next, let's consider the ingredients, particularly the cream in ice cream. Modern ice cream typically relies on dairy products with a significant fat content. Cream, full-fat milk, milk solids, often eggs for custardy richness, which contribute to its smooth texture and mouthfeel. While ancient Egyptians did have access to milk from cattle and goats, and could make butter and simple cheeses, their ability to produce and utilize a high-fat cream in the quantities and consistencies needed for an ice cream base was likely limited. Their dairy was precious, and much of it was probably consumed fresh quickly, fermented, or turned into more stable products. The rich, fatty cream that gives modern ice cream its luxurious body was largely a product of later dairy farming and processing advancements in cooler climates. So, while some Egyptian chilled treats might have incorporated milk or a skimmed cream equivalent, they wouldn't have had the creamy, fatty backbone of true ice cream. The sweeteners also differed significantly. Ancient Egyptians relied on the intense, natural sweetness of honey, dates, figs, and other fruits. Modern ice cream, for the most part, uses refined sugar sucrose, which became widely available much later in history. This difference in sweeteners would lead to a very different flavor profile, the ancient treats having a more complex, fruity, sometimes almost molasses-like sweetness from dates, or a distinctly floral note from honey, compared to the more neutral, intense sweetness of refined sugar. Then there are the stabilizers and emulsifiers that are crucial to the texture of most commercial and even many homemade modern ice creams. Ingredients like guar gum, carrageenan, or lecithin from egg yolks help to prevent large ice crystals from forming, ensure a smooth texture, and stop the mixture from separating. The ancient Egyptians, of course, had none of these specialized ingredients. Their chilled fruit purees would have derived their texture purely from the fruit pulp itself, perhaps some natural pectins, and the skill of the preparer in achieving a smooth consistency through pounding or straining. This brings us to the all-important texture in the process of making. Modern ice cream achieves its characteristic smooth, creamy, and scoopable texture through the process of churning the mixture while it is freezing. This constant agitation incorporates air known as overrun and, crucially, keeps the ice crystals that form very small, preventing a solid, icy block. The ancient Egyptians had no such churning while freezing technology. Even if they had managed to get a bowl of sweetened fruit juice incredibly cold using hypothetical relays of mountain snow, without simultaneous churning, it would simply freeze into a solid, hard block of ice, more like a giant, flavored ice cube than a delicate sorbet. Their actual chilled treats, cooled by evaporation or other gentle means, would have been, as we've discussed, more like a cool, thick liquid, a soft slush, or a smooth, chilled paste. Definitely not something you'd serve with a traditional ice cream scoop. You might need a straw or a very dainty spoon. True ice cream, involving a churned and frozen mixture of dairy, sugar, and flavorings, is a much later invention, with significant developments occurring in Europe from the 16th and 17th centuries onwards. Relying on advancements in ice harvesting, the understanding of using salt to lower freezing temperatures, and eventually, mechanical refrigeration in the 19th and 20th centuries. The journey from an ancient Egyptian chilled fig puree to a modern Italian gelato or a rich French vanilla ice cream is a very long and winding one, spanning millennia and multiple cultures. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to freezing technology is that the concept of using saltpeter potassium nitrate or other salts mixed with ice or snow to achieve temperatures below the normal freezing point of water, a key discovery for early ice cream making before mechanical refrigeration, was unknown in pharaonic Egypt. This technique, which allows for the actual freezing of a surrounding mixture, appears in writings in India, China, and the Arab world much later, eventually making its way to Europe. Without this crucial piece of chemical knowledge, even if the Egyptians had abundant ice, creating a smoothly frozen dessert would have been nearly impossible. Defining the exact point at which a chilled dessert historically transitions into a proto-ice cream or true ice cream is somewhat subjective and depends on the criteria g. The actual presence and use of ice for freezing, dairy content, the churning process, resulting texture emphasized by food historians. However, by almost any definition that includes actual freezing and a creamy or crystalline frozen texture, the ancient Egyptian concoctions, however delightful they may have been, fall into the category of chilled treats or cool refreshments, rather than ice cream or even sorbet as we understand them. This distinction isn't meant to diminish the achievements of the ancient Egyptians. What they accomplished in creating any form of cool refreshment in their intensely hot climate, using only natural principles and immense labor, was remarkable. Their chilled fruit nectars and cool purees were, in their own context, the height of luxury and ingenuity. They represent a vital, if very early and unlikely chapter in the long human quest for delightful, temperature-defying treats. They weren't eating ice cream, but they were definitely dreaming in cool. And that's a delicious thought in itself. Trying to explain a modern triple chocolate fudge brownie ripple ice cream, perhaps with lactose-free vegan soy milk, to a pharaoh would likely result in utter bewilderment, followed by a demand for a very large sample and possibly the deification of the Ben & Jerry's delivery guy. Our long, sleepy journey through the sands of time, in search of the unlikely origins of ice cream in ancient Egypt, is now drawing to a gentle close. We've felt the desert heat, tasted the phantom sweetness of pharaohs' feasts, pondered the monumental challenges of sourcing ice, and marveled at the ingenious ways Egyptians coaxed coolness from their environment. We've also come to understand that what they created and enjoyed, while undoubtedly luxurious and refreshing for its time, was a world away from the frozen, churned delights we call ice cream today. So, what is the cool legacy of ancient Egypt in this long, delicious history? What can we take away from their efforts as we drift off to sleep? The most profound legacy, perhaps, is a testament to human ingenuity in the face of environmental challenges. The ancient Egyptians didn't have snowy mountains on their doorstep or advanced freezing technology, yet, driven by the universal human desire for comfort and pleasure, in this case, relief from intense heat, they observed natural principles like evaporative cooling and the coolness of the night air and the earth, and they harnessed them to the best of their ability. Their porous earthenware jars, their fanned cooling stations, their shaded cellars. These were all expressions of a deep, practical intelligence, a way of working with their environment rather than trying to completely overcome it. It's a story of adaptation and clever resourcefulness. This ingenuity also highlights the human constant, the pursuit of refreshment, sensory pleasure, and luxury, even in the most demanding of circumstances. A cool, sweet fruit puree in the court of a pharaoh might seem a simple thing to us, but in its context, it represented a significant investment of labor and resources, and therefore a significant luxury. It speaks to that enduring human trait of seeking out and elevating experiences that delight the senses, that offer a brief escape from the mundane or the uncomfortable. The ancient Egyptians, for all their monumental building and complex theology, were also people who clearly appreciated the good things in life, including a refreshingly cool treat on a hot day. Did any specific chilled dessert traditions from ancient Egypt directly survive or significantly influence later Egyptian or broader Middle Eastern cuisine? This is a complex question. Many traditional Middle Eastern and Egyptian desserts today still feature ingredients prominent in ancient times, such as dates, honey, nuts, and a variety of fruits, showcasing a long and rich culinary continuity. Think of the sweet, fruit-based sharbat drinks from which the word sherbet and sorbet eventually derived popular across the Middle East. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some modern Egyptian sharbat or rich fruit juice concoctions, which are often served chilled, could be seen as distant cultural descendants or parallel developments stemming from that same ancient desire for cool, intensely flavored, fruit-based refreshments. While direct lineage is hard to prove definitively, the preference for these types moff ingredients and refreshing forms certainly has ancient roots in the region. The unlikely origins aspect of our story is, in itself, a key takeaway. It was unlikely that ancient Egyptians had anything resembling true ice cream, given their climate and technology, but their determined pursuit of coolness, their ability to create something special and refreshing with the limited means they possessed. That is the real fascinating story. It reminds us that innovation doesn't always require groundbreaking new inventions. Sometimes it's about the clever application of existing knowledge and resources. The boring history approach we've taken, focusing on the details, the practicalities, the labor, and the limitations, hopefully provides a more nuanced and realistic understanding than a sensationalized claim of pharaohs invented ice cream. The real history is often quieter, more about incremental developments and adaptations. It's about the patient fanning of a water jar, the careful pounding of dates, the generations of accumulated knowledge about how to make life a little more pleasant in a challenging world, the degree to which specific ancient Egyptian food preparation techniques for chilled items directly influenced later Coptic, Islamic Egyptian, or broader Middle Eastern culinary traditions, versus being independent developments or perhaps reintroductions or influences from other cultures like Persia or Rome, especially during the Hellenistic and Roman periods in Egypt, is a complex area of culinary historical research. Cultures and cuisines are rarely static. They borrow, adapt, and evolve. What is certain is that Egypt, with its ancient appreciation for fruits, honey, and the pursuit of coolness, formed part of that broad ancient Near Eastern cultural matrix, where the earliest ideas of sweetened, chilled treats began to take shape. Even if other regions, like Persia, took the lead in developing true ice-based desserts. So, as we let these thoughts settle, the legacy of ancient Egypt in the story of ice cream is perhaps less about a direct invention and more about being one of the earliest civilizations to so clearly demonstrate the desire for such a thing, and to apply their unique ingenuity to achieving at least a refreshingly cool approximation. They laid down a marker in the sand, a testament to the enduring human quest for that perfect, sweet, cold mouthful, and that, in itself, is a pretty cool legacy. Maybe the next time you enjoy a scoop of your favorite frozen dessert, you can give a little nod to those ancient Egyptians, fanning their porous pots under the desert sun, dreaming, perhaps of a day when coolness would be so much easier to come by. And who knows? Maybe one day we'll find a hieroglyph that translates to needs more sprinkles. And so, our exploration of ancient Egypt's unlikely brush with the ancestors of ice cream comes to a gentle, sleepy end. We've felt the desert sun, imagined the cool touch of an earthenware jar, and tasted the phantom sweetness of dates and honey on a pharaoh's palate. The quest for coolness in a hot land was a testament to their ingenuity, a quiet story of human desire and adaptation whispered across millennia. As these images of golden sands, bustling Nile banks, and shadowy palace cellars begin to soften and fade, allow your mind to drift away from the ancient world. There are no more hieroglyphs to decipher tonight, no more hypothetical recipes to reconstruct, only the smooth, inviting path towards your own deep and peaceful rest. Let the gentle cadence of this story become a soft current, carrying you further from the shores of wakefulness into the calm waters of slumber. Feel the comfort of your surroundings, the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. The heat of the Egyptian desert is a distant memory, replaced by the soothing coolness of your own tranquil space. Any thoughts that remain are like grains of sand, trickling softly away, leaving your mind clear and serene. There is nothing left to do, nowhere else to be. The ancient world, with all its wonders and its simple and profound efforts, now recedes, making way for the restorative embrace of sleep. Surrender to that gentle pull into the quiet darkness where dreams are spun, and your body and mind can find true refreshment. May your night be as peaceful and deeply satisfying as the coolest, sweetest dream on a warm Egyptian night. Sweet dreams.